Let's start with the absolute masterpiece by Pragnanandhaa against Sarana. d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight c3, d5. We have queen opening declined, and this is round 12 of Tata Steel chess tournament in Netherlands. Pragnanandhaa, Indian grandmaster, chooses exchange variation, exchanging the pawns on d5. This is the most popular variation, by the way, played in this particular tournament. Bishop goes to g5, pinning the knight to the queen. c6, typical move to support the pawn on d5. Queen goes to c2, not to allow the bishop to develop on a nice diagonal on a square f5. Therefore, bishop goes to e6. e3, opening the squares for the light square bishop. Knight develops to d7, supporting the knight on f6. Bishop goes to e2, developing. Bishop d6, and now bishop d3. This is very subtle, by the way, in case you're wondering why Pragnanandhaa couldn't put the bishop immediately on d3 if that's what he wanted to do. And the reason being, if he played bishop d3 here, black would play h6, bishop h4, g5, bishop g3, and knight h5. And they would exchange their knight for a good bishop, black square bishop, on g3. And that would be a good exchange for black. Instead, now, in this variation, with the knight already on f6, black plays h6, bishop goes back to h4, g5, the same plan, bishop goes to g3, and now what happens is that if knight goes to h5 with the same idea, that bishop on d6 is under attack. So therefore, black still exchange the bishops, but they need to get rid of their own bishop doing so. So bishop takes g3, hg, opening the file for the rook. Sarana plays queen e7, and Indian grandmaster Pragnanandhaa develops the knight on f3. g4 looks like a logical move, attacking the knight, but in reality, that's not a good move. And the reason it's not a good move because it kind of blocks all black pieces on the king side of the board. Their attack should have continued eventually with the moves h4, h5, h4, slicing white position on the king side. After they played g4, they first of all blocking their own bishop, and the bishop becomes really a poor piece for black. And also, after knight goes to h4, everything on the king side is blocked. Sarana's attack basically stopped. So he goes to the other side of the board with the knight b6. Castle, long castle for Sarana, and white starts immediately attacking on the queen side of the board with the move a4. Makes total sense. Prophylactically, Sarana moves his king to b8, removing him from the open file on c. a5, attacking the knight. Knight goes to c4. White plays knight a4 in order to put their knight on a nice square on c5. And Sarana answered with knight d6, trying to occupy a central square e4 with one of his knights. Knight c5, good square for the knight on c5, a6. Now, here is the important point that in this particular position, a6 wasn't really good because black plays b6 and white cannot take the pawn on c6 because after rook c8 they lose the queen. The queen has no moves. So that was one moment here. But after knight goes to c5, a6 is already a threat. Therefore, Serena plays a6 himself and blocks white pawn on a5. Rook c1, and bishop goes c8, full defense for Serena, putting another protector to this weak pawn on b7. Queen b3. Now, several threats here to take the pawn on a6, which is pinned. And here, Serena goes knight b5. The best move for him was just to move the king to a8 and save the pawn this way. Knight b5 is a significant mistake in this position. And the reason it's a significant mistake, you would think that this move protects the pawn on a6. Instead, Pragnanandhaa sacrifices the knight, takes it on a6 with a check, beautiful move. B takes a6, rook takes c6. White position is totally winning. The king is weak. All white pieces are attacking the king. Black goes rook d7. That's a smart move because it eliminates the threat of bishop b5, queen takes b5. Now there is rook b7. And this was position already even. So that's why white are not in a rush to take on b5 and instead activate the knight from the side of the board, going to a nice square f5 and attacking the queen on e7. The queen moves back to e8. Now white takes on b5, and after a takes b5, they don't take the pawn with the queen, because again, rook b7 will equalize the game. They play a6, another beautiful move, and the threat is a7. That's why the rook goes to a7 to block the pawn, and now queen takes b5 check, king a8, and knight goes to d6. Knight is joining the attack. Another big mistake by Serena, bishop e7, but to be honest, in this position, black was already lost. Any move they would make would lead to losing position. This is already losing position, but bishop d7, I'm not even sure. Maybe Serena wanted to be a part of a brilliant finish of this game, and he saw the continuation and wanted his opponent to play the next move. You can pause this video now and try to come up with the brilliant move by Pragnanandhaa. Checkmate in 3 moves. And the first move is queen b7 check. Absolutely brilliant move, putting the queen under attack of the rook. The only move is... Now, in this position, by the way, Serena resigned. Why he resigned? Because the next move is a takes b7 with a check. The only move, king b8, and rook a8 would finish the game with the checkmate. So this is the way Pragnanandhaa finished this beautiful combination. Now has 8.5 out of 12. And let's take a look at the game by another leader of the tournament, Gukesh Damaraju, the world champion, who is playing black against Jordan Van Foreest from Netherlands, who is playing white and starts with d4, d5, c4, e6, knight c3, bishop e7. I wasn't lying when I said that the most popular opening in this tournament is Queen's Gambit declined and exchange variation. Exchange the pawns on d5, bishop goes to an active square on f4, c6 to support the pawn on d5, e3 to activate the bishop, bishop f5. In this particular game, white didn't play queen c2, therefore the bishop develops in the nice square f5, knight goes to e2, not on f3, because the plan eventually would be f3, e4, pawn break in the middle. Black goes knight d7, rook takes c1, knight takes f6. These are all developing moves. And here knight g3. Knight g3 attacking the bishop on f5. Now, the question could be, why not knight g3 right away in this position. And in this position, the reason it was not played, because after bishop g6, white does not have a move h4, because they would be losing a pawn. Now what happened in the game? After rook c1, knight f6, now black would not be able to take the pawn on h4, and therefore knight g3, bishop g6, h4. Very active on the king side for white. h5 is a threat, so black plays h5 themselves, but now the pawn on h5 eventually becomes weak. And white immediately starts putting pressure on that pawn with the move bishop e2. Queen b6. Gukesh is changing sides where he plays and then now goes to the queen side, attacking the pawn on b2. Not that it's a big threat, but still queen d2 to protect the pawn on b2. Knight g4. This is the first mistake of the game by Gukesh, and I have to say that this game was full of mistakes by both sides. Both sides could have won this game several times, and I'm guessing round 12, players are tired. Also, the pressure, especially on Gukesh, is enormous. He is one of the leaders. He has to win this game, and therefore he was trying to win this even in the positions where he was worse. So good for him. He plays active, but knight g4 was a mistake. And the reason it was a mistake because white could immediately play e4. The knight from f6 was controlling this square in e4. After e4, white had a very nice center and very, very pleasant position. Instead, Van Foreys didn't see that and played bishop g5. Black cannot take on g5 because after h take g5, the pawn on h5 becomes very weak. This knight on g4 is under attack because the pawn is pinned to the rook. And the most important thing in this position, that the knight on g4 would be lost because it has no moves. So no matter what black plays, next move for white would be f3, attacking this knight on g3, and the knight has no moves. So therefore the exchange of the bishops is not good. That's why bishop goes to d6, bishop goes to f4, back to e7, back to g5. In grandmaster language, those two moves are called offering a draw. Because let's repeat the moves 3 times and it would be a draw. But again, remember, Gukesh came here to win. So he plays queen d8. Now, this position is objectively better for white. But Gukesh decides to play this for the win, although the opponent offered him basically a draw. f3, attacking the knight. The knight goes back to f6, short castle. And knight goes to h7. Short castle was a mistake. The reason it was a mistake because the pawn on h4 becomes undefendable. And the first move to capitalize on that is knight h7. Bishop takes e7, queen takes e7, and you can easily see that you cannot protect the pawn. And white plays f4 with the idea to play f5. Now queen takes h4, and now queen e1. Now, what would happen if white played f5? Then black seems to take the knight on g3. So this variation doesn't work. Black just have 2 extra pawns and a totally winning position. Therefore, queen goes to e1, protecting the knight on g3. Black goes f5 because now f5 for white was already a threat. So black are blocking this move by themselves. But on the other hand, their bishop becomes very poor piece because it has really no moves. Very nice tactical Shot, easy for grandmasters to find, obviously. Knight takes h5, getting the pawn back. Now you cannot take the knight with the bishop because your queen is under attack. Therefore, black plays back, queen e7. Bishop goes to a more active square on f3, and also protects the pawn that was under attack on e3. Black exchanges the pieces on h5, and now this was another decision that Gukesh had to make. Where do you move your king from the check? You move it to the queen side of the board or to king side of the board? And the correct way to play this was actually to move it to the queen side of the board, escapes on c7, and create an attack on h file by doubling your rook. Gukesh chose to play king f8. Again, it wasn't the best decision. And the knight goes to a beautiful square e5. That's actually a very educational move, knight d1, because you can always look at your position and see which pieces are not in ideal positions. And this knight really doesn't do anything here. It has really no good moves, doesn't protect anything, doesn't attack anything. So you want to move this knight to a better square, and the square in e5 is the best square for this knight. And therefore, knight goes to d1. Knight b6. Black wants to activate the knight on c4. Bishop g6. Queen e6 attacking the bishop. Exchange. I'm sorry, first check. Queen b4 check. King goes to g8. Now exchange the pieces on h7 square. And rook f3. Rook f3. Because again, the plan is to play knight f2. But if you play it right away, the pawn on e3 is under attack. Therefore, first rook f3. Protecting that pawn on e3. Rook e8 and knight f2. Knight f2, the plan is still the same. Knight goes to a good square on c4 for Gukesh, putting more pressure on this pawn on e3. Still, knight d3 played by Jordan 148. He is not afraid of the move. Knight takes e3, because white would simply play rook e1, pin that knight, and eventually will win it, and would have an extra piece. Gukesh here plays rook h4, creating some ideas on the h file. Knight goes to e5, and black plays b5. Gukesh is protecting his good knight on c4 with 2 pawns. Queen c5, attacking the pawn on c6. I'm sorry, too fast. Queen h6. The threat is rook h1 check and winning the rook on c1. So white moves the king to f2. And Gukesh plays rook e6 to protect the pawn on c6 with the queen and the rook. 148 here plays a beautiful move, a rook takes c4. He quickly realized that his knight on e5 is worth a lot more than the knight usually worth. This knight on e5 is worth at least a rook. This is how strong this knight is. Therefore, he can sacrifice a rook and still have a better position. D takes c4, queen takes a7. So we can see the position in which 148 has a knight and 6 pawns against a rook and 5 pawns for black. And this position considered a little better for white. Gukesh plays queen f6, rook g3, putting some pressure on the pawn on g7. If the queen moves away, there would be a checkmate there. Gukesh goes rook h1, makes sense. He wants to get the pawn on b2. Knight d7 is attacking the queen and creates actually a very interesting trap, because black has to be very careful where they move the queen. If, let's say, they play queen f7, for example, then there is a queen b8 check, and if you block with the rook, there is knight f6 with a double attack. Cannot take with the pawn because it's pinned, cannot take with the queen because you're gonna lose the rook. So Gukesh had to be careful where to put his queen and made the right choice, put the queen on d8. Knight e5, knight goes to his favorite square. There is a checkmate on g7 coming. Grandmasters don't miss the checkmate, they protect it with the move a rook e7. Queen a6. Now this is a mistake. And it's not easy to see that this is a mistake. Now, first of all, what would be the best move? The best move was queen a3. Now, queen a6 was played, and the mistake was because there is a sacrifice from Gukesh. Rook takes e5. Now, black sacrifices the rook. And now what's important, that if you take the rook with the pawn from d4, after queen d2, black is going to checkmate white in a couple of moves. And therefore, the only move is f takes e5, and here is the important move f4, slicing white's position, disjoining those pawns. Now, if you take on f4, you're gonna lose after queen d4, queen takes d4 check, and again, the white king is not safe here, it would be checkmated eventually. Therefore, one for ace plays rook h3, f takes e3. Now again, if king takes on e3 after queen g5, black position is totally winning, so white has to be careful and play an important move, king e2. And here comes rook b1. Very difficult to understand what happened to Gukesh here, because a very simple way to win this game was to exchange the rooks on h3 and take the pawn on d4. And this queen endgame with extra pawn for black, but most important, with the pawn on e3, ready to promote to e1 in most of the variations. Of course, it wouldn't be so easy here because white start checking and everything, but on a grandmaster level, this position is totally winning for black. Instead, rook b1, and this game immediately swings to white's advantage. White takes on c6, rook takes b2 check, and here maybe Gukesh thought that white has to take the pawn on e3. And if they did, then the queen activates on g5, and again, black is winning. But white doesn't have to take the pawn, it's not checker, so they play king f3. Queen f8 check, king e4. The king goes to the middle of the board, but it's safe. A rook f2 with the threat of queen f4 checkmate. One for ace goes queen e6. And here Gukesh makes another big mistake, and he plays a rook f7. And in this position, Jordan one for ace could play queen g6. And after queen g6, he could actually continue playing for a win. In this position, there is a checkmate on the way. Obviously, it's not going to be blundered, but this position is definitely in white's favor. Instead, he doesn't think at all. Look at his clock. It was 1923, and now it's 1928, so 30 seconds was added for the move, so he didn't really think for more than 5 seconds. took the pawn at e3, and Gukesh now has a draw. He checks the king from a8, d5, and queen a2. And what happens here that the white king cannot escape the checks. The queen would be checking the king from the back ranks. So let's say if white plays d6, there would be queen g2 check, king d4, queen d2 checks, check, and it will continue forever. Therefore, in this position, 1-4S realized he cannot win this anymore and decided to make a draw. Queen c8 check, rook f8 protecting the king, queen e6 check, rook f7, and this is a repetition of moves, and both opponents agreed to a draw. Very fascinating game. And the last game I want to show you includes another leader, Nozirbek Abdusadorov from Uzbekistan, who is having a great tournament and has 7.5 points out of 12 and was in top 3 leaders of the tournament the whole tournament. And he's playing against Arjuna Rigasi from India, who is having a terrible tournament. He has 4.5 out of 12, despite the fact that he is second highest rated player in this tournament with a rating of 2801 before the tournament started. We want to start with this position. This was a Nimzo Indian defense. The opening was Nimzo Indian. White has 2 very good bishops, and therefore their position is slightly better, but the material is even. Both kings are safe. The bishop on c6 is active. Knight on h5 is maybe on the side of the board, but can get into the game quickly. So this position is pretty equal. And here Nozirbek makes a mistake and plays queen g5. What he didn't realize probably that the white has very strong move g4. g4 was played, and what happens is that although the knight is currently not under attack because the pawn is pinned, but white is threatening to play h4, attack the queen, and then win the knight. So let's say we'll make any move, let's say b6, h4, and the queen cannot go to white squares here because there is light square bishop operating on that diagonal. The queen will go away, white will take the knight, will be with an extra piece and win the game. So after g4, black plays f5, which is a smart way to save a piece, because now after h4, queen goes to g6, you still cannot take the knight because the pawn is pinned. Bishop takes f5, and you think, what's the problem? Black will lose eventually this knight, but queen goes to f7, and now turns out that if the white takes on h5, black will take on f5. So that would be an exchange of pieces. So therefore, Erigaisi plays a better move, rook d6, with the idea to play bishop g6, forking the queen and the knight. Therefore, the knight goes back on f6, g5. Now, let's take a look. Oh, there is no move bishop g6 anymore because the rook is not covering the square g6. So g5 attacking the knight, h takes g, exchange the pawns on g5, the knight is under attack, the knight goes to h5. And Ergisi plays bishop g4. Now, in this position, if he played bishop g6, after queen e7, actually black escapes, because if you take the rook, black takes the rook as well. So let's say, I'm sorry, in this position, if white takes the rook on e8, bishop takes e8, rook is under attack. After rook goes to d5, Actually, this position is still very much winning for white, but after queen g5, black at least have some chances. So instead, Erigaisi decided to play bishop g4. And now g6 is on the way with the idea to win the knight on h5. Queen goes to e7, attacking the rook on d6, and white decided to win this game the traditional way. They just took the bishop on c6, and after b takes c6, took the knight on h5. Queen g5 check, bishop goes back to g4, and it seems like easily winning position for white in general, because two bishops are much stronger than the rook. But not in this particular position, because here Noderberg plays e4. And that's an important move here that makes black position survivable. You cannot take the pawn because the bishop would be under attack. So therefore king goes to f1, freeing up the bishop, who was pinned. Queen goes to g6, and queen c2, pinning the pawn to the queen. Much better position for white. And here black Noderberg makes another critical mistake and plays a rook f8. The move makes sense because now the pawn on f3 is pinned and the bishop on g4 therefore is under attack. But Garisi plays a simple move, queen g2, protecting everything. And now after e takes f3, there is a brilliant check on e6 with the bishop. Maybe Abdusadorov didn't see that move, but in any case, after bishop e6 check, you cannot take the bishop with the queen because there is a checkmate on g7. Therefore, king goes to h7, pretty much the only move. Check from h3, the only move, queen h6. And in this position, a very simple, subtle move, king f2. And what happens is now that black have no way of avoiding exchanging the queens. And if you exchange the queens, this position is totally winning for white. So rook goes to b8 with the last attempt to create some counterplay on the queen side. Bishop f5 check, g6, and Arigaisi ended this game in a style. Bishop takes g6, sacrificing the bishop. King takes b6, queen e6 check, kings go to h5. Now, there are not really many moves here for the king, by the way. In most variations, same thing happened as it happened in the game. So king goes to h5, and here comes a grandmaster type of move. So you would think that the most logical would be to go queen e5 and take the rook on b8, but again, that would create some counter chances for black. So let's say queen e5 check, queen g5. Not only counter chances, but if you take the rook, you're going to get checkmate. So therefore, white had to be careful. And again, grandmaster type of bishop f6. Cutting the black squares, cutting the escape route of the black king. So now black goes queen h7, which is pretty much the only way to escape a checkmate. The checkmate is queen f5 on the way. So queen goes to h7. Now queen e5 check. King goes to g6. The rook is taken, and in this position, Abdusadorov resigned. What? Why did he resign here? He just takes the bishop on f6. We have queen and 4 pawns against the queen and 4 pawns. Why would you resign here? You resign here because If you eliminate the queens from the board, this pawn game is totally winning for white because they will take on f3, and then the king just will take care of all those weak pawns, and with an extra pawn, white is easily winning. And it turns out that black cannot avoid exchanging queens. Queen d6 check would be one of the variations. And no matter where the king goes, let's say it goes to g5 to prolong exchange of the queens, queen f4 check, king g6, queen e4 check, king g7, and exchange of the queens happen. King takes the pawn on f3, and then just goes and collects all those pawns, and white pawns will promote. So Nodirbek Abdussadorov, who was having a great tournament, didn't have a good game in round 12, and let's take a look at the standings. Gukesh Damaraj and Pragnanandhaa Ramesh Babu, two Indian grandmasters, are leading the way with 8.5 points out of 12, and Nodirbek Abdussadorov is third with 7.5 points, with Vladimir Fedoseev trying to catch him up, having 7 points out of 12. Tomorrow is the last round, and the most important games would be Gukesh Damaraja will be playing against another Indian grandmaster, Arigaisi. Gukesh would be playing white, and Pragnanandhaa would be playing black against the German grandmaster Vincent Keimer, who currently has 5 points out of 12. If I wanted to make a prediction, I would say that because Gukesh is playing with white pieces tomorrow against Arigaisi, who is not having a good tournament at all, and Pragnanandhaa is playing black against Keimer, my prediction would be that Gukesh would win tomorrow, and Pragnanandhaa will either draw or lose. But we'll see what happens tomorrow, and until then, thank you for watching.